Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia CZV tutorial series. I'm going to do a preset deep dive today. This is the Community Spirit preset, one of the stock plugins that comes with the synth. I'm going to pull it to bits to find out how all the stuff that we've learned in this series all hangs together in a real world context. This is what the preset sounds like. Huge, sweeping pad, gorgeous sound. I'm going to pull it to bits and find out some of the interesting stuff that the sound designer's done with this preset that we can use when we're building our own. If you've enjoyed this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's an awesome way to do it. Okay, off we go. The first thing that I'm going to do is turn all the effects off because I want to hear what the native sound of the synthesizer sounds like without all of these. We are going to have to bring all of these back. They play a really important role in the sound, but this is what the synth preset sounds like without any of those effects. So it's still a very nice sound, but it's much cleaner now and it's easier for us to hear what's going on, particularly with effects like reverb and delay. If they're washing everything together, it can sometimes be really difficult to pick out the subtle stuff. So that's what the preset sounds like when all of those things are stripped away. Now, a big part of the reason why this preset sounds so fat and thick is that it's based on unison. Have a look down at the bottom, we've got unison 4 engaged, which means the synth is using 4 voices for every single note that you play. That also implicitly limits our polyphony to 8 because we have 32 voices to play with in total. So when I press a single note on the synthesizer, that's generating 4 different voices and unison detune in the top bar, which is basically offsetting each one of those 4 oscillators to provide that thickness of sound. If I double click on the unison detune, it's a much plainer sound. And you can hear it dialing in. 41 is quite heavily detuned and playing an enormous role in providing that thickness. This stuff is really easy to miss. You can get lost in the minutiae of the DCWs and the individual lines and forget that there's this absolutely massive elephant in the room. The fact that 4 different sounds have been detuned against each other is going to have an enormous role to play in the overall sound. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing is that if we have a look at the pitch envelopes for the 2 lines, we've got this tiny little pitch envelope on line 2. I'm just going to turn line 1 off so that we can have a listen to that. We've just got that tiny little bit of pitch bend. If I make it really intense, down at these really subtle values, we get a much more interesting effect, a much more interesting sound. Now when I'm doing these preset deconstructions, because I'm messing with so many of these values, you step further and further away from the original preset. So a nice thing to do is to get yourself back to your absolutely basic preset and create yourself base camps. If I turn all of the effects off on this unit again, for instance, having just reset the preset, this is exactly the same sound, but now it's got no effects units. So if I head up into the menu and save the preset as temporary and save it in my template folder, I have a test folder in templates and I can say save. Now this is my new starting point. If we have a look at the effects, they're all turned off. I can step away from that preset and come back to it. And now I can change all of these settings with impunity, not worry about it, throw them all away and get back to where I started. Okay, let's have a look at these basic modulation values because this applies to the whole sound again. Got a little bit of noise here. Let's have a listen to that. There it is. And you can see it was 0.017%, but it matters. The difference between 0 and very little indeed. Get that extra little bit of hiss. These really subtle, tiny little differences of sounds, like with your pitch envelope and your noise, they're what contribute to the overall richness of sound. You know, very often, subtle is best. Let's have a listen to this ring modulation. Providing a slightly atonal colour. There's the simple sound. And there's more of it coming in. So there's our basic sound, essentially deconstructed now. Have a look at our DCWs. So this is what's happening with the morph engine. As you can see on line 1, we've got no DCW knob, which means the envelope is doing the heavy lifting. On line 2, it's completely the opposite. DCW is turned all the way up, so line 2 is going to be pretty static. And there you can see line 1 evolving, line 2's got nowhere to go because it's already been turned up to maximum. Throw those changes away, and back we are with our bass sound. Now let's have a look at the modulation page, because there's quite a lot going on in here. Starting from the left-hand side, we've got some vibrato depth on the mod wheel. There you can hear it coming in, but it's really pretty subtle. If you want to accentuate a setting, go for it. Press the note down. Bring loads of it in. And as we turn the modulation wheel up, you can really hear what's going on. Don't be afraid to push these things to the maximum. We can always throw all of those changes away, get back to the original preset, and we're back to where we started from. Moving on to the next mod value, we've got FX1 filter cutoff. Okay, so at this point, we're going to need to bring FX1 back in. We get 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of an anti-clockwise loop for these FX. So let's turn number 1 back on. So there are 3 different modulation sources for FX1 cutoff, and we need to understand how they all interrelate. 2 of them are positive, how hard we hit the key and what position on the keyboard at the chromatic scale we play it. And one of them is negative, basically pulling us back. And the one that's pulling us back is this macro slider here. Now don't forget, when these macro sliders are set to the middle, they're at 0% because they're bipolar. So at the moment, this thing's not doing anything. We've just got positive values. So now at the moment, it doesn't matter. If I press this key as lightly as I possibly can, and then hard, they sound pretty much identical. It's because the macro slider needs to be introduced in order to pull this modulation value down. At the moment, we're basically maxed out. The effect itself, the cutoff's turned all the way up. So we've got nowhere to go. Our cutoff is constantly at full. Whereas when I increase this slider, if I turn it all the way up to maximum, now we've got this minus 0.6, which is pulling that virtual knob down, and it's giving the velocity somewhere to work. So now if I press a really light key and harder, there it is coming in. So the timbre slider on the macro control is having an overall kind of master effect on the sound. It also stands to reason that if we pull this slider down, we're not doing anything. We're only going to have an impact on the sound when we introduce this kind of negative pull down, the generation of headroom. So let's bring that all the way up. Fabulous. Bring that down. And obviously I played the whole range of the keyboard there to give you that sense of we've really tipped the seesaw. This keyboard follow being introduced has made the low notes more accentuated and the high notes much more trebly. Next along we've got this pair of modulations, line 1 and line 2, DCW envelope rate. So these 2 mod destinations are being controlled by macro 2. It's called time. We have a look on the synthesis page. If I press a note, you can see progress through those envelopes. Now turn the macro slider up. You can see both of those envelopes traveling much more quickly. A really obvious impact on the evolution of the sound as that DCW is being basically cranked in, the envelope is being cranked in with the mod slider. Sorry for my husky voice, I'm just recovering from a cold. Double click that, set it back to 0. In fact, I'll throw everything away and get us back to a nice blank palette again. Next, what have we got? Line mod amount. Let's have a look over on the synthesis page. So that's this value here. The basic amount of ring modulation that we start with without any macro slider being introduced is the 35.2. As we turn the slider up, we're going to push that more. We're going to go more atonal as more ring modulation is introduced. Exactly the same as increasing this bass value. Bring that back down again. So it just gives us a flexible dynamic control over this value here. Double click that. And macro 4 is pulling triple duty. So we've got FX3, the delay amount, the dry wet, and FX4 is doing 2 different things, the reverb dry wet, but also the reverb decay. Let's introduce the delay first, turn that on. All the way up. So it's increased the delay a little bit, but it's only 0.176. So the total difference between its basic setting, its default setting, which is the 36.4% that's set by the slider, plus this extra 0.176. Similarly with the reverb, let's bring that in. And now we've got the dry, wet and the decay that have their default values set. You can see the decay is coloured because it has a modulation source attached to it. That's absolutely cavernous up at the maximum. So these values being added onto the bass are generating that enormous tail. Bring it all the way down. That's the basic setting of the sound. So hopefully that's given you some cool ideas of options available to you when you're building your own presets from scratch. Ultimately, you're going to want to be able to start with a completely blank palette and build a sound that sounds as good as this from scratch. But that's an awful lot to ask. You know, there's a lot to learn. So jump on the shoulder of these sound designers. People have, the guys at Arturia have given you this enormous bank of sounds to play with. Pretty much every one of these is going to have something to learn. If you load it up and really figure out how the sound is generated, it's going to really help you develop an intuitive understanding of how this synthesizer can be made to sound good. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks a lot.